So let's hear a big round of applause for Tom Palmer.
Thank you. All right, I think this is working. Well, this has been really an honor for me to be here with you and to listen and learn a great deal from the participants. It's also a personal honor to meet people who are really dedicated in each country to advancing the frontiers of personal freedom, the institutions that make possible rising prosperity, and so that we can see the 21st century to be the Asian century, which is what I think is going to happen. But here we've been talking about welfare populism, and I'd like to go through a few themes that have occurred to me as we have been discussing it. But first, of course, it's an institution that goes by many different names in different countries. But what is startling about it is it's growing. I think it is the challenge that faces us over the next coming decades. Socialism, as we know it, is dead. You only find it in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Harvard University, and a few other remote outposts. But as a real challenge, I think it's over. But the welfare populist movement is a serious one. It is one that is a serious challenge to our liberal values. It creates advantages for rulers and political constituencies for its continuation. One thing that's become clear is we need to understand this not merely as beneficent or generous gestures by our rulers, which is how they portray it, but rather a political system to cement their control and power. But that is the key element of understanding it. Now, as I've listened to the conversations, a few themes have jumped out at me. I will not forget the discussion of marshmallows and spinach. It's a very clear image about the difficulty of delaying gratification. We, in fact, had this in the discussion right now of the measures, the new tax on real estate transaction in Hong Kong. It looks so easy to suppress the rising property prices for local people. The long-term consequences will be very, very bad for Hong Kong if they continue with this practice of taxing foreigners more heavily. But among the discussions from the former Prime Minister of Thailand, it was really striking, was the issue of how we can deal with emotional appeals of populistic politicians. They say, don't you want to help this person right here? In a way, that's the marshmallow in front of us. And it's difficult to respond to that with what he prefers, which is rational deliberation. Actually talk about what is the cost? Is there a net benefit involved in this? So as a challenge to us, we have several options. One, perhaps we can come up with emotional appeals to counter theirs. So the Tea Party movement does that in the United States, but they appeal to a certain set of traditional values in America, the Constitution, and so on. That would be something that needs to be done in every single country, how to do this. But that's one option. Counter their emotional appeals with emotional appeals that will promote liberal values. Then the second is find some means to put people into this framework of thinking rationally, of considering costs, and thinking about the long term. That's a very difficult challenge for us. In fact, I think we have to do some of both. We need to focus on policy implementation over the long run. The welfare populism is not just one movement, one time. It's a dynamic process. It sets in motion one intervention that leads to another. Indeed, I think the best way to understand the current global financial crisis, which is now driving more of this welfare populism, was it was caused by welfare populism. In the United States, 1994, the American government made a plan to make everyone a homeowner. Even if you don't save, why should you have to save just to buy a house? You should have a right to have a house. And they set a goal of moving American homeownership from 64% of the market to 70%. But you know, there's some reason the 65th to the 60th to the 70th percentile were not owning homes. They hadn't saved money. They weren't yet old enough. They're college students. No, everyone should own a home. And they endorsed what they call creative financing. Remember that phrase. It's in the White House statement of 1994. Encourage creative financing. And the consequence was a global financial meltdown because of welfare populism in the United States to give everyone the chance to own a home. And now on top of this, one measure after another, after another, after another. So we have to understand those issues. And we need to find ways to get people to understand policymakers cannot bind themselves. In economics, we talk about time inconsistency of decision making. For me to say now, I will bind my behavior in the future is very, very difficult. It may be the case today, I say, yes, I'll respect your property rights, until they're valuable enough for me to take them in future. But if I cannot restrain myself as a ruler, you're not going to invest. What we found consistently is politicians will make initial promises. It's just a small thing. It's only to help this little group. And they grow and grow and grow because there are political incentives to widen the base of constituents. Politicians cannot bind themselves, and most importantly, they cannot bind their successors. I debated this issue on the BBC a few weeks ago in London. And the BBC supporter was more or less on my side. He said, but people were told all these programs they were paying into was a contributory system. Your money was being invested. But it was just spent. There's no saving. It was just spent. And the defender of these welfare programs admitted, he said, well, yes, that's what people were told rhetorically. In other words, they were lied to. Systematically, because the next group of politicians changed the rules. Food subsidies and fuel subsidies. These create dependency on the state. They distort markets in terrible ways. They have very, very harmful effects systematically, as we've seen, especially in the case of fuel subsidies in so many countries, and ultimately leads to a fiscal collapse. Because the state finds a population expecting to pay 20 cents a liter for petrol, as it is in some countries. When the state can't pay it, people are going to go out and burn the petrol stations. Iran is facing this problem right now because of their subsidized fuel. So accordingly, what do we have to do? Explain clearly the real cost of such policies. And now, here's the difficult problem. How do we talk about the future, since it's not here now? And I think we need to talk about our children. Connect people today to the fate of their children and grandchildren. They may begin to think differently about these policies if they realize it means their children and grandchildren will be bankrupt. They won't be able to afford a house or to afford retirement and so on. And finally, some key elements. Wealth creation and prosperity depend on economic freedom. The great Asian philosopher Friedrich has explained this so clearly in his presentation. Economic freedom is the most important input into production. And what better example than Hong Kong? As I explained to people, Hong Kong has very little natural resources. It's a lot of rocks covered by Chinese people. There's no oil, there's no gas, there's no gold, no diamonds. What do they have? Rule of law, economic freedom, and it produced the amazing, fantastic city we see around us. Wealth is created in the private sector, but this is very important. We have to remember law is typically created mainly in the public sector. So we must not forget our attention to the importance of the public sector. It produces the law. The rule of law is the key. But it is undermined when government goes beyond it to get into business itself. It fails to be able to produce law effectively. Then, lastly, the elephant in the room, inequality. Here, there was a discussion that I think needs to be further pursued. Do markets cause greater inequality? Some people argue that. Or is the inequality the fact of unequal access to markets, because many people are not given the market freedom. Parth Shah, a colleague who couldn't be here from India, has pointed out that the 1991 reforms in India created capitalism for the few, but most Indians were not introduced to that market liberalization. It was not extended to the areas where they live. What they need is market liberalization or capitalism for the masses. And then finally, as several speakers have mentioned, we need to learn from the past examples of crises caused by welfare populism. Argentina was mentioned, one of the richest countries in the world, destroyed by populist politicians, by Peronism, by the idea we could redistribute everything and buy support for the masses, and what is happening in Greece. I'll address that a little bit more in a moment. What we've seen in the case of pension systems, for example, and many medical systems, these are systematically pay-as-you-go systems. They're so easy to introduce. It looks costless. The initial generation gets more than they put in, but the consequence is disaster in the future. They're pyramid schemes. If the base of the pyramid does not keep growing, they collapse. We were told, don't worry, that's 30 years in the future. Well, we were told that 30 years ago. And now we have the problem that we are facing. Let me just look very quickly at some of the data from Europe. I couldn't find as many for Asian countries. The fiscal imbalance, the present value of the difference between tax revenues and expenditures under current law. In the United States, the most conservative estimate is at least $80 trillion. It's currently being recalculated. Jagadish Gokhale has a team of people working on this. He says it may be as high as 137 now. But at minimum, $80 trillion, and the minimum for the European Union nations, $53 trillion. And these are very conservative, low-ball estimates of the fiscal imbalance. Another way to think about it is the percentage of current GDP that would have to be extracted from the economy. This is not a percentage increase in government. It's a huge piece of the entire economy that would have to be taken out and devoted just to financing the fiscal imbalance forever, assuming that those benefits are never increased, which we know politicians cannot keep themselves from doing. So what are the results of welfare populism? Dependence rather than independence. And that means also a loss of personal dignity. It means incoherent systems that mix insurance with redistribution, telling people we're setting the money aside, but in fact it's being redistributed, leads to incoherence and unfunded liabilities. Displacement of civil society organization, social fragmentation, and political crisis. Let me conclude with some thoughts that were suggested by Dr. Zumthor in his very important and incisive opening remarks. He reminded us of a certain politician who created welfare populism. This man. It's one of his more dashing outfits, the way I like to remember him. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, specifically created these systems of welfare statism not because he was a beautiful, wonderful man, but to create political support where there were political strategies. And he was quite clear about it even at the time. The consequence for Germany was not so heavy. The most advanced welfare state in the world was the Weimar Republic. They were proud of this, and it led to a horrifying political and social collapse. As one of the most malicious populist politicians in the history of humanity rose to the fore, and as he said, Germany will be at its greatest, its poorest citizens are its most loyal. The consequence, the most horrific and malignant welfare state in the history of humanity that looted entire countries in order to finance benefits to the political supporters of the regime. Now we might think, well, that's ancient history. Maybe not. Let's look at what is happening in Greece. I fear more countries face a Greek future than seem to realize it. And our conservative friends cannot claim to be the solution. In Greece, they were the problem. The Conservative New Democracy Party raised spending from 42% to 51% in 5 years, added 100,000 of their members to the government employment rolls. In a small country, 100,000 new government employees. All of this was cronyism and populism. And what is the consequence today? The rise of street riots in this political party, the Golden Dawn Party. They're not very subtle, if you can recognize their symbol there. This is a true fascist, Nazi-oriented party, blaming all of their problems on foreigners, on Albanians, on blacks, on outsiders, on Asians, not on themselves. This is a frightening warning of what can happen when welfare populism is unchecked and continues on. I think there's a better way, and we've seen it in these discussions here. Promote public awareness of the real costs of welfare populism, including for our children and future generations. I think we should get rid of pay-as-you-go programs and immediately ask, is it sustainable? Can this continue, or is it a Ponzi scheme, as so many of these programs are? Personal savings accounts are very important, should be moved in to replace state pensions. I think there should be general cutback on state expenditures to meet current obligations. You cannot just abandon them. Encourage, this is a hard one, a culture of responsibility. Here, we need to be called on to be moralistic. Talk about some return to some traditional values of personal responsibility, found in every Asian culture, absolutely, without any question, deeply rooted in ideas of responsibility for one's behavior. Think about Taoism in China, or Confucian ethics, or the ideas of Dharma in India, Islamic values. All of the cultures have a foundation for that. And then allow civil society to fill the space vacated by the state. And lastly, a little advertisement for my book. So this is an extremely rare item. Only 175,000 of these exist. And if you want a copy, get one from me. Thank you.